On the morning of March 8, 1979, at approximately 9:42 a.m., FBI Special Agent Catherine Morrison sat at a gray metal desk in the New York field office's Counterintelligence section, examining a photograph that had been taken 16 years earlier. The photograph was 16 years old, and it would destroy 2 lives. It showed a young man in his mid-20s standing in front of what appeared to be Moscow State University. Wearing a dark suit and holding a briefcase, his face was clear in the image: angular features, prominent cheekbones, dark eyes that looked directly at the camera. The photograph had been taken in 1963 by a CIA officer working under diplomatic cover at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, part of routine surveillance of Soviet students who might later enter government service or intelligence work. Morrison, 41 years old, had been assigned to Soviet counterintelligence for 8 years. She had what her colleagues described as an exceptional memory for faces, a skill that had proven valuable in identifying Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in the United States. That morning, she was reviewing surveillance photographs taken 3 days earlier, on March 5, 1979, outside the Soviet mission to the United Nations in Manhattan. One photograph in particular had caught her attention: a man in his early 40s exiting the Soviet mission building, carrying a leather attaché case, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a gray overcoat. Something about his face triggered recognition. Morrison began systematically reviewing older photograph files, searching for a match. She started with recent surveillance from the past year, then expanded backward through 1978, 1977, 1976. After 2 hours with no result, she requested access to archival materials from the 1960s, photographs taken when the CIA and FBI had been documenting Soviet students and junior diplomats who might later become significant intelligence targets. In these older files, Morrison found the 1963 photograph of the young man at Moscow State University. The face was 16 years younger, but she was certain it was the same person. The bone structure, the set of the eyes, the distinctive shape of the jaw, all matched. A handwritten notation on the back indicated the photo had been taken on May 14, 1963, with a partial name: Sokolov, V. There was a reference number linking it to a CIA file. Morrison requested the associated CIA file through proper channels. It arrived 4 days later, on March 12, 1979. The file was thin, consisting of approximately 30 pages from the early 1960s. According to these documents, the subject's full name was Viktor Alexeyevich Sokolov, born in 1938 in Leningrad. In 1963, when photographed, he had been a 25-year-old graduate student studying international relations with focus on American political systems. The CIA file indicated Sokolov had come to American intelligence attention because of his exceptional academic performance and selection for programs often used as KGB recruitment pipelines. Analysts in 1963 had assessed him as a likely candidate for eventual KGB recruitment, though there was no definitive evidence. The file noted he had attended lectures by known KGB recruiters operating under academic cover and had traveled to East Berlin in 1962 for what was described as a special training program whose exact nature could not be determined. After 1963, the file contained no further information. For 16 years, his photograph had remained in the archives. Before we continue with how this 16-year-old photograph would unravel an espionage operation, if you're interested in the documented realities of Cold War intelligence work and the human consequences of espionage, subscribe and turn on notifications. We examine patterns from declassified cases and the real dynamics behind intelligence operations every week. Now, let's follow how the FBI began building their case. According to diplomatic records, Sokolov now held the official title of First Secretary in the Soviet mission's Political Affairs section. He had arrived in New York in October 1978, approximately 5 months earlier, accompanied by his wife, Irina, and their teenage daughter, Natalia. The family lived in a Soviet diplomatic housing complex in Riverdale in the Northwest Bronx. The FBI's assessment, based on Sokolov's background and current position, was that he was likely a KGB intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. His official responsibilities, monitoring American political developments, preparing reports on U.S. foreign policy, attending functions where he could observe and network with American officials, provided perfect cover for intelligence collection. His 1960s training, his sudden emergence in a diplomatic posting after years of absence from intelligence records, and his position giving access to valuable American information all supported this assessment. Surveillance of Sokolov intensified immediately. FBI agents began documenting his daily movements, contacts, and routines under strict protocols designed to avoid detection while gathering maximum intelligence. Over the following weeks, what emerged was a portrait of careful compartmentalization. Sokolov's official duties appeared conventional, attending receptions, meeting with academics and think tank researchers, preparing reports. His family life seemed normal for Soviet diplomatic families. His daughter attended school for diplomatic children. His wife worked part-time as a translator. The family was observed grocery shopping, attending Russian Orthodox services, taking weekend trips to parks and museums. But there were anomalies. On March 19, 1979, 11 days after Morrison had identified him, Sokolov departed his apartment building at 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning, unusual for diplomatic personnel who typically didn't work weekends without specific reason. He drove not toward Manhattan, but north into Westchester County. FBI agents following documented his route to White Plains, approximately 20 miles from Riverdale. In White Plains, Sokolov parked at a shopping center, walked through it, and entered a bookstore for approximately 12 minutes. When he emerged carrying a small paper bag, he walked to a nearby coffee shop and entered. Inside, he ordered coffee and sat at a table near the window. He removed from the bag what appeared to be a magazine and began reading. At approximately 8:47 a.m., a man entered the coffee shop. FBI agents described him as appearing mid-50s, approximately 5 feet 9 inches tall, with gray hair and glasses, wearing casual clothing, jeans, a sweater, and a jacket. The man purchased coffee, then approached Sokolov's table and appeared to ask if he could sit. Sokolov looked up, responded affirmatively, and the man sat across from him. The surveillance team photographed the interaction through the coffee shop's windows using telephoto lenses from positions across the street. The two men appeared to converse for approximately 8 minutes. At one point, Sokolov showed the man the magazine, pointing to something on one of the pages. The man nodded and examined it. Then Sokolov placed the magazine on the table between them and stood up, leaving the coffee shop. The man remained seated. As Sokolov exited, the man picked up the magazine and began reading it. The surveillance team split. 2 agents continued following Sokolov, while 2 remained to identify the unknown man. Sokolov drove directly back to his Riverdale residence, arriving at approximately 10:15 a.m., making no other stops. The unknown man remained in the coffee shop for approximately 20 minutes after Sokolov departed, reading the magazine. Then he left, carrying the magazine, and walked to a car parked in the shopping center lot, a tan Ford sedan. FBI agents documented the license plate and followed as he drove south toward New York City. He drove to an apartment building in Yonkers and entered through a side entrance carrying the magazine. License plate registration indicated the vehicle was owned by David Lawrence Howard, age 54, with an address matching the Yonkers apartment building. FBI background checks revealed Howard was employed as a systems analyst at Digital Communications Systems, Incorporated, a defense contractor based in Stamford, Connecticut. The company specialized in communications equipment for military and intelligence agencies. Howard had worked there since 1971 and held a secret-level security clearance, granting access to classified communications systems information. The FBI now had documentation of what appeared to be a meeting between a suspected Soviet intelligence officer and an American defense contractor employee with classified access. The meeting had occurred in a location far from where either man lived or worked. The magazine exchange, a classic espionage technique for passing information through concealed messages, microdots, or instructions, further suggested an intelligence operation. David Lawrence Howard became the focus of intensive investigation. Agents compiled a comprehensive profile. Howard had been born in 1925 in Philadelphia. His father had been a machinist, his mother a seamstress. David had served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, though he saw no combat as he was only 18 when the war ended in 1945. After discharge, he attended Temple University on the GI Bill, studying electrical engineering. He graduated in 1950 and worked for various electronics companies throughout the 1950s and 1960s before joining Digital Communications Systems in 1971. Howard had been married twice. His first marriage, to Barbara Mitchell in 1952, ended in divorce in 1968 with no children. His second marriage, to Susan Carmichael in 1970, appeared stable. Susan worked as a librarian at Yonkers Public Library. They lived in a two-bedroom apartment in a building housing primarily middle-class professionals and retirees. The background investigation revealed nothing obviously suspicious. Security clearance applications showed no red flags. His finances appeared normal for his income level, approximately $32,000 annually. Above average but not unusually high for a systems analyst with his experience. He and his wife had modest savings, no significant debts beyond a car loan, and lived within their means. But the FBI was now operating from suspicion based on the Sokolov meeting. The working hypothesis was that Howard might have been recruited by Soviet intelligence and might be providing classified communications systems information. The question was when and how recruitment might have occurred, and what information Howard might have already provided. Surveillance of Howard began on March 23, 1979, 4 days after his meeting with Sokolov. His routine was conventional and predictable. He commuted approximately 1 hour to Stamford each day, worked a standard 8-hour shift, and returned home each evening. On weekends, he and his wife ran errands, attended occasional social events, and spent time at home. There were no obvious signs of espionage activity, no unusual meetings, no visits to potential dead-drop locations, no contact with known Soviet intelligence officers other than the March 19th meeting that had triggered the investigation. The FBI obtained authorization for a wiretap on Howard's home telephone installed on March 27, 1979. For 2 weeks, the wiretap produced nothing significant. Howard's phone conversations were routine, discussions with his wife about household matters, occasional calls to friends or family, brief work-related calls. His wife's conversations were similarly mundane. Then, on April 10, 1979, at approximately 9:23 p.m., Howard received a call that immediately drew attention. A male voice with no discernible accent asked to speak with David. Susan answered and called her husband to the phone. The conversation was brief. Male voice. "Hello, David. This is Martin calling." David Howard. "Oh, hello. I wasn't expecting to hear from you." Male voice. "I wanted to check on your progress with the documentation we discussed." David Howard. "Yes, I've been working on that. It's taking longer than I anticipated." Male voice. "That's fine. Quality is more important than speed. Can you have it ready by the end of next week?" David Howard. "I think so, probably by the 20th. Male voice. "Good. Same location as last time?" David Howard. "Yes, that should work." Male voice. "Excellent. I'll be in touch." The conversation lasted less than 1 minute. Voice analysis suggested the caller might be the person Howard had met in White Plains, though poor audio quality made definitive identification impossible. More significantly, references to documentation, a deadline, and same location as last time suggested an ongoing intelligence relationship rather than an isolated incident. The FBI immediately intensified its investigation. The decision was made to conduct a covert search of Howard's apartment, requiring special judicial authorization due to Fourth Amendment concerns. Authorization was granted on April 12, 1979, and the search was conducted on April 16th while both David and Susan were at work. The search team, consisting of 6 agents with specialized training in covert entry, entered at approximately 10:30 a.m. and spent 4 hours methodically examining the apartment's contents. The apartment was typical of middle-class professionals, modestly furnished, clean and organized, with bookshelves containing engineering, history, and literature books, a small vinyl record collection, and various personal items and photographs. In Howard's home office, a small second bedroom used as workspace, agents found what they were looking for. Hidden in a locked file cabinet was a folder containing approximately 40 pages of technical documentation related to communications systems. Digital Communications Systems was developing under Department of Defense contract. The documents were classified secret. According to markings and dates, Howard had accessed and presumably removed them between February and April 1979. Some pages showed signs of having been photographed, slight indentations suggesting they'd been pressed flat under glass, and barely visible fingerprints matching Howard's prints. Also in the locked cabinet was a small black notebook containing what appeared to be coded notations, dates, numbers, and abbreviated phrases. Later analysis by FBI cryptographers would determine the notebook was a log of Howard's espionage activities, recording dates when he obtained information, dates when he passed information, and amounts of money received, all written in a simple substitution cipher Howard had apparently created himself. The most significant item was a Minox camera, a small specialized camera associated with espionage because of its ability to photograph documents in low light and its compact, concealable size. The camera was hidden in a shoebox in the back of a closet, wrapped in cloth. Technical analysis showed it had been used recently, with traces of developer chemicals on parts of the mechanism. The FBI also found $8,400 in cash, hidden in various locations, $3,000 in an envelope taped to the back of a drawer in the bedroom dresser, $2,200 in a hollowed-out book on a living room bookshelf, and $3,200 in a metal box in the building's basement storage area, accessed by a key found in Howard's desk. This cash amount was far beyond what would be expected for normal household expenses and suggested payment for espionage activities. The FBI photographed all evidence and documented its location, but did not remove anything during the covert search. The goal was to gather intelligence while avoiding alerting Howard that he was under investigation. The evidence would be used to obtain arrest and search warrants when the decision was made to take him into custody. The question facing investigators was whether to arrest Howard immediately or continue surveillance, hoping to catch him passing information to his handlers and potentially identifying other participants. The decision was complicated. Allowing Howard to continue risked additional classified information being compromised. Immediate arrest might not provide enough evidence to fully understand the operation's scope or identify all participants. The decision was made to continue surveillance but closely monitor Howard's access to classified materials at his workplace. The FBI contacted Digital Communications Systems and, under strict secrecy, informed company security officials about the investigation. The company agreed to implement additional monitoring to ensure Howard did not access any new classified materials beyond what he had already obtained. This would limit further damage while allowing the FBI to potentially observe Howard meeting with his handlers. On April 19, 1979, the day before the deadline mentioned in the April 10th phone call, FBI surveillance teams were deployed in force around Howard's apartment, his workplace, and various locations where he might potentially meet Soviet contacts. Agents were positioned throughout Yonkers, along his commute route, and in White Plains, where the previous meeting had occurred. Howard left work at his usual time, approximately 4:45 p.m., and drove home, arriving at 6:20 p.m. FBI agents maintained observation of the building throughout the evening. At approximately 8:15 p.m., Howard exited alone, carrying what appeared to be a manila envelope, and got into his car. He drove north out of Yonkers, taking routes that suggested he might be heading toward White Plains. However, Howard did not drive to White Plains. Instead, he drove to Mount Vernon, immediately adjacent to Yonkers, and parked on a residential street near a small park. He exited carrying the manila envelope and began walking. FBI agents on foot surveillance followed at a distance. Howard entered the park and walked along a path curving through a wooded area. Streetlights illuminated parts of the path, but left other sections in relative darkness. At approximately 8:52 p.m., Howard stopped at a park bench near a cluster of trees. According to surveillance reports, he sat down and placed the manila envelope on the bench beside him. He remained there for approximately 3 minutes. Then he stood up, leaving the envelope on the bench, and began walking back toward where he had parked. FBI agents photographed the entire sequence, capturing clear images of Howard placing the envelope on the bench and walking away. 2 agents remained in position to observe the bench, while others followed Howard back to his vehicle. Howard drove directly home, arriving at approximately 9:20 p.m. He entered his building and did not emerge again that evening. At the park bench, FBI agents maintained observation of the manila envelope. At 9:34 p.m., approximately 40 minutes after Howard had left it there, a man approached the bench from the opposite direction. FBI agents photographed him as he walked past the bench, paused, looked around as if checking that no one was watching, reached down and picked up the envelope, and continued walking. The man was Viktor Sokolov. The FBI now had documentation of a complete dead drop operation. Howard preparing classified documents, placing them at a predetermined location, and Sokolov retrieving them. This was sufficient evidence for arrest and prosecution. The pattern mirrored the 1985 John Walker case, where a Navy warrant officer had been photographed making dead drops that looked exactly like ordinary life until examined through counterintelligence lens. The decision was made to arrest both Howard and Sokolov, though Sokolov's diplomatic status would protect him from prosecution and result in his expulsion rather than imprisonment. David Howard was arrested at his home on the morning of April 21, 1979, at approximately 6:30 a.m., before he would have left for work. 6 FBI agents knocked on his apartment door. Susan Howard answered. When informed they had a warrant for David Howard's arrest, she appeared genuinely shocked and confused, asking repeatedly what her husband was being accused of. Howard himself, according to the lead agent's report, appeared resigned rather than surprised. When his hands were behind his back and he heard the handcuffs click, he said quietly, "I suppose I knew this would happen eventually." A full search of the apartment was conducted under warrant, with agents removing the classified documents, the Minox camera, the coded notebook, and the hidden cache. Susan Howard watched in apparent disbelief as agents systematically searched their home. Her hands trembled as she held onto the kitchen counter, asking over and over, "What did you do, David? What did you do?" When an agent emerged from the bedroom closet holding the shoebox, the same shoebox she had given David for his birthday 2 years earlier, and opened it to reveal the Minox camera, she stepped back from the counter and sat down heavily in a kitchen chair, her face drained of color. According to later interviews, she had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities and had genuinely believed his work and activities were entirely legitimate. Viktor Sokolov was declared persona non grata by the U.S. State Department on the same day. FBI agents and State Department officials arrived at the Soviet mission to the United Nations and informed Soviet authorities that Sokolov was being expelled from the United States for activities inconsistent with his diplomatic status. Sokolov, his wife, and their daughter had 1 week to leave the country. They departed New York on April 28, 1979, aboard an Aeroflot flight to Moscow. Sokolov's subsequent career in the Soviet Union is not documented in available records, though it is presumed he continued to work for Soviet intelligence in some capacity. David Howard was charged in federal district court with conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized communication of national defense information to a foreign government, and unauthorized retention of classified documents. The charges carried potential sentences of up to life imprisonment. The case was assigned to Judge Margaret Hendricks of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. Howard's attorney, court-appointed public defender Robert Kramer, faced an extremely difficult case. The evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance photographs, the wiretapped phone conversation, the classified documents found in his home, the Minox camera, the coded notebook, the hidden cache, and the FBI's photographic documentation of the dead drop operation. There was virtually no possibility of acquittal if the case went to trial. During interrogations conducted by the FBI in late April and early May of 1979, Howard provided a detailed account of how he had become involved in espionage. According to interrogation logs, he had first been approached by Soviet intelligence in 1976, approximately 3 years before his arrest. The approach had occurred at a technical conference in Boston, where Howard was presenting a paper on digital signal processing techniques. A man who introduced himself as Peter Dalton had struck up a conversation after his presentation, expressing interest in his work and asking technical questions that demonstrated knowledge of the field. They had exchanged business cards and continued occasional contact over the following months. A lunch meeting when both happened to be in New York, a phone call to discuss a technical article, correspondence about industry developments. The recruitment process had been gradual and subtle. Dalton, whose real identity was never definitively established, though FBI investigators believed he was likely a Soviet intelligence officer working under deep cover, had developed a friendly relationship with Howard over approximately 6 months. He had eventually suggested that certain technical information about American communications systems might help Soviet engineers better understand international telecommunications standards, which could improve cooperation and interoperability. The suggestion had been framed not as espionage, but as contribution to technical progress and international cooperation. According to interrogation logs, Howard offered inconsistent explanations for his espionage. He cited financial pressures, intellectual engagement with handlers who valued his expertise, vague ideological sympathy for Soviet technical advancement, and ultimately acknowledged he felt trapped once the relationship began. FBI interrogators concluded he had been gradually recruited through exploitation of his vanity and incomplete understanding of consequences rather than through ideological commitment or severe financial distress. The financial compensation had been modest, approximately $14,000 over 3 years from 1976 to 1979, less than half of Howard's annual salary, but significant supplemental income for a man living on a middle-class salary in an expensive metropolitan area. What emerged from interrogations was a portrait of a man who had not set out to become a spy, but who had been gradually and skillfully recruited through a process that exploited his vanity, his financial anxieties, and his incomplete understanding of the implications of his actions. Facing overwhelming evidence, Howard agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a recommended sentence that would make him eligible for parole after 15 years, rather than facing the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. The guilty plea meant that the trial consisted primarily of sentencing proceedings. At the sentencing hearing in September 1979, prosecutors presented the classified damage assessment prepared by the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. According to this assessment, Howard had compromised technical information about at least 7 different communications systems under development by Digital Communications Systems and other defense contractors. The information included specifications for encryption methods, signal processing techniques, and hardware designs that Soviet military planners could use to develop countermeasures and potentially compromise U.S. military communications security. Howard's attorney argued for leniency based on his client's cooperation with investigators, his lack of any previous criminal record, and what the attorney characterized as his limited understanding of the harm his actions would cause. The attorney also emphasized Howard's apparent remorse and his willingness to accept responsibility for his choices. Judge Hendricks, in her sentencing remarks, acknowledged the complexity of the case, but emphasized the seriousness of espionage and the breach of trust that Howard's position had required. She noted that Howard had held a security clearance, a privilege granted based on trust that he would protect classified information, and had deliberately betrayed that trust over a period of 3 years. She noted that his motivations, while perhaps not purely mercenary, had included financial gain, and that he had continued his espionage activities over an extended period despite having multiple opportunities to stop and report the contacts. On October 18, 1979, David Howard was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Under federal sentencing guidelines at that time, he would be eligible for parole after serving approximately 12 to 15 years, assuming good behavior. Howard was initially incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Ray Brook, New York, a medium-security facility in the Adirondack Mountains. The impact on Susan Howard was immediate and devastating. Within days of David's arrest, reporters had identified her and begun attempting to interview her. She disconnected her phone and stopped going to work at the library, eventually resigning from her position in May 1979. She told friends that she felt humiliated and betrayed, She had been married to David for 9 years and had believed their relationship was based on honesty and trust. The discovery that he had been engaged in espionage for the final 3 years of their marriage, that he had been lying to her, taking money she had known nothing about, and putting both of them at risk, shattered her sense of reality. She filed for divorce in June 1979, less than 2 months after David's arrest. The divorce was finalized in November 1979 and was uncontested. According to court records, Susan cited David's criminal conduct and his betrayal of their marriage. She moved out of the Yonkers apartment and relocated to New Jersey, where she found work as a librarian at a community college. Friends who remained in contact later reported that she struggled for years with feelings of shame and with questions about whether she should have noticed something wrong with her husband's behavior. David Howard served 17 years of his 25-year sentence. He was released on parole in 1996 at the age of 71. By that time, the Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and the communications systems he had provided information about had been replaced by newer technologies. He moved to a small apartment in upstate New York and took part-time work at a hardware store, one of the few employers willing to hire someone with his criminal history. He never remarried. Susan Howard had remarried in 1984 and had apparently built a stable life for herself. She declined all requests for interviews about her former husband and refused to discuss the matter publicly. David Howard died in 2004 at the age of 79. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his espionage conviction, listing only basic biographical information and noting that he had been preceded in death by his parents and survived by no immediate family members. There was no funeral service, and he was cremated. There was no one to collect his ashes, which remained at the funeral home for several months before being scattered in accordance with standard procedures for unclaimed remains. Years later, partially declassified damage assessments revealed that while Howard had provided genuinely sensitive technical information with intelligence value, the long-term impact was limited. The technical information became obsolete as communications technology advanced rapidly during the 1980s and 1990s. Enhanced security procedures were implemented after his arrest. The Soviet Union's 1991 collapse fundamentally changed the strategic landscape. Whether any specific military or intelligence outcome could be directly attributed to Howard's espionage remains impossible to determine. Intelligence operations are cumulative, with many small pieces from many sources assembled into larger pictures by analysts and planners. The case became something of a teaching tool within the FBI's counterintelligence community, used in training programs as an example of the value of maintaining comprehensive photographic archives. For Catherine Morrison, the case represented a significant success in her career. She received commendations from the FBI and was eventually promoted to supervisory special agent. In later interviews after her 1998 retirement, she reflected on the randomness of the identification, how the photograph might never have been taken, properly filed, survived 16 years in the archives, or come to her attention at the exact moment she was reviewing recent surveillance. "Recognition is what counterintelligence is," she said in a 2001 interview. "Matching faces across time, connecting past to present, seeing patterns invisible to others. But recognition also has a cost. Sometimes you recognize something and wish you hadn't." Viktor Sokolov's fate after his expulsion from the United States in 1979 is not documented in available records. According to limited information from defector accounts and declassified intelligence assessments from the 1980s, Sokolov continued to work for the KGB after returning to Moscow, though apparently not in any position involving foreign postings after his exposure in New York. The question of responsibility in cases like this is complicated because it requires distinguishing between the immediate causes of espionage and the broader context in which choices were made. Howard chose to engage with Soviet intelligence recruiters. He chose to provide classified information. He chose to accept payment. He chose to continue the relationship for 3 years. Those choices were his, and he bore moral and legal responsibility for them. But he made those choices in a Cold War environment that created opportunities and incentives for espionage, in a defense industry that granted security clearances to thousands of people while relying on imperfect monitoring systems, in an intelligence landscape where both Soviet and American agencies aggressively sought to recruit sources, and in a personal situation where the combination of financial pressure, intellectual engagement, and gradual escalation of commitment made it difficult for him to recognize the full implications of what he was doing. The Soviet intelligence officers who recruited and handled Howard were operating within a system that valued intelligence collection and treated human assets as tools to be exploited for state purposes. The FBI agents who investigated him were operating within a system that prioritized national security and granted broad authorities for surveillance and investigation. The judicial system that sentenced him was operating according to legal frameworks designed to punish espionage and deter similar conduct. What remains certain is the human cost, not just to Howard himself, but to those who bore no responsibility for his choices. The photograph that Catherine Morrison examined on the morning of March 8, 1979, captured Viktor Sokolov as a 25-year-old graduate student 16 years earlier. He stood in front of Moscow State University holding a briefcase, looking directly at the camera with an expression that suggested confidence and ambition. There was nothing in that image that could have predicted what would happen, that he would become a KGB intelligence officer, that he would operate under diplomatic cover in New York, that he would recruit and handle an American defense contractor employee, that he would be exposed and expelled because someone 16 years later would recognize his face in a different photograph. David Howard was 51 years old when the photograph identified his handler and led to his arrest. He was 79 when he died, alone in a small apartment, having spent his final years working at a hardware store for minimum wage. In his last interview with researchers in 2002, he spoke about the money. $14? 000 over 3 years. And how absurd it seemed that he had sold his freedom, his marriage, and his integrity for less than half of 1 year's salary. He spoke about Susan with evident regret, acknowledging that his betrayal of her had been as significant as his betrayal of his country. The photograph captured only a moment 16 years before that moment mattered. It showed a young man in front of a university, ambitious and confident, with no indication of what he would become or what damage his career would cause. It led to an arrest, a destroyed marriage, 17 years in prison, and a lonely death in a small apartment. The photograph remained, evidence, history, training material, but also a reminder that every intelligence operation involves human beings making choices whose consequences extend far beyond what any image can capture, and far beyond what anyone at the moment of choosing could possibly foresee.